is a big deal that we won the NLRA in 35, but it's also a big deal that it was so weakened in 47 and left so many folks out, particularly in a racialized and gendered way.
Which side are you on?
The National Labor Relations Act is the law that basically sets out the labor relations regime in the private sector in the United States. So there's a lot to know about the Labor Relations Act and a lot to know about what it doesn't cover. So Adam, talk to us about what should people know about the National Labor Relations Act as it relates to, their rights on the job, their ability to organize, how they should interface with their employers, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So the NLRA, it's also known as the Wagner Act. It was passed back in 1935. So, as you said, it is like the system. It sets up the framework for how labor unions operate in the private sector. And notice I said private sector. So one of the things that we ask in this movement a lot, and it's already been discussed a lot today on this show, is, how do federal and state policies either limit or expand workers' rights to form and join unions? We talked earlier about Vermont and the Vermont PRO Act and how that's actually expanding unionization rights. But we also mentioned SB 231 here in Alabama, which removes incentives from companies who voluntarily recognize their unions, which in effect forces the employees to go through the NLRB election process. That election process was actually set up by this framework, the NLRA. So 1935, when this was passed, was actually when most private sector workers first gained their legal protection to organize and bargain a union contract. Obviously, we had unions for decades before then. In fact, the first trade union that I'm aware of that formed in the United States happened when George Washington was still president. So unions have been around for a while, but in terms of actually getting a legal recognition and a framework for how these should operate at the national scale, it wasn't until 1935, of course, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed that law. It was one of the signature achievements of the New Deal. We saw during the 1930s a massive upsurge of labor organizing during the heights of the Great Depression, and this mass movement of working people helped propel these significant reforms of the New Deal era. So 3 things to know about this federal labor law, the NLRA. Number 1 is that it did have a transformative effect on the economy. Private sector union density tripled in the first decade after the law was in place. Now, if you check some of the history, and I'm currently reading The Southern Key by Michael Goldfield, and he's one of the historians that thinks that maybe the NLRA gets a little bit too much credit, and that, the law itself maybe is not the sole reason or even the primary reason why there was such a jump in union membership after it was signed. And so some would argue that these conditions were already in play, right? There was already massive organizing happening. So it wasn't so much that the law caused the organizing, but the organizing was happening and, in fact, helped cause the law. Regardless, right, it took the shackles off, and it did allow unions to go out to the mines, to the factories, to the workshops, and say, the United States government says you can have a union. President FDR says you should join a union, right? And that's huge. And so it's certainly better when you can get at least neutrality out of the state, as opposed to the fierce opposition that unions had encountered for so many decades prior. So that was the first big thing. It tripled union density in the first decade. But the second big thing to note is that it excluded many folks. Again, this is 1935. This is during the Jim Crow era. many of the Southern congressional representatives and senators are very much beholden to white supremacy. They may have been Democrats, and so technically in the same party as FDR, but that doesn't mean they had the same ideology per se. And so to get this bill passed through the Congress, there were a lot of loopholes, and it excluded many black, brown, and women workers through occupational carve-outs. It just so happened to exclude domestic workers, which were disproportionately black women. It excluded agricultural workers, disproportionately black and Hispanic workers. It excluded the public sector. So healthcare workers and teachers and others were also excluded. So predominantly female professions. So those were big loopholes in the law. So for all of its, huge achievements for so many workers who were in the private sector, certainly folks were left out. And then the last thing to know is that the NLRA, as written, the Wagner Act, was really only in place for a dozen years or so. It was significantly weakened in 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, and it has been whittled away ever since, really, through various means.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
But the Taft-Hartley Act was such a drastic weakening of the law as to almost be a replacement of the law and not really an amended version of it, in my opinion. And the Taft-Hartley Act passed pretty overwhelmingly. In 1947, there was a anti-labor backlash right after the World War II, and the business class organized hard and saw the growing power of the union movement. They saw the way in which unions took advantage of this NLRA throughout the 30s and 40s, and they struck back, and they fought back hard. And so the Taft-Hartley Act is what we live with today. And if you ever hear union folks talking about the need to repeal Taft-Hartley, now you know a little bit why, because it banned quite a bit of permissible activities under the original NLRA. And something else to mention is that those exclusions to the NLRA, the Wagner Act, also extended to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, right? So the NLRA sets up the rules for labor organizing and dealing with unions. The FLSA is what set up the regime for minimum wage, overtime, those sorts of things. And so those same exclusions of black and brown and women workers were also applied to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And you can actually go back and look at some of the debate from Congress, and you can see Southern legislators, such as Florida Congressman James Mark Wilcox, talking about how fundamentally they did not want the U.S. government prescribing the same wage for black and white workers. That you can't put black and white workers on the same basis and, quote, get away with it. So most of these exclusions and weaknesses are actually still with us today. And that leaves a lot of this up to states, and for states to, close some of those loopholes, which leads us into a problem, right? Because for every Vermont, there's an Alabama. So who got left out? Those folks continued to organize, and some did win legal bargaining rights later in the 20th century. For example, the letter carriers and other postal service workers were eventually able to win their unions, win collective bargaining rights. We also saw, Dr. King in his very last campaign was in Memphis in April 1968, supporting striking sanitation workers. And there was a wave of public sector organizing throughout the 60s and into the 70s. It was sort of infused with the spirit of the social movements at the time, civil rights and the women's movement. We saw the United Farm Workers and farm workers out west, particularly in California, organize and win some rights eventually. Teachers, it varied by state. Teachers in California won full collective bargaining rights. Teachers in Alabama, Mississippi, predominantly southern states, never did achieve those collective bargaining rights. And so those loopholes still stay with us. There are still millions of workers in the domestic sector, the agricultural sector, and the public sector who do not have the same union rights that the traditional private sector employee has. And that's unless state or local governments take some action, or there is a change to the law at the federal level, which seems pretty unlikely, given the way Congress has operated in recent years. We saw a big push for the PRO Act, still has not been signed. The PRO Act would address some of those weaknesses in the Taft-Hartley, but, here it is, 2024. Biden's facing re-election. We're at the end of his first term. We still don't have the PRO Act. So that leaves a lot up to the states, up to local governments to, address some of this, to expand collective bargaining rights. But that's where we're at. It is a big deal that we won the NLRA in 35, but it's also a big deal that it was so weakened in 47 and left so many folks out, particularly in a racialized and gendered way. So that's sort of where we're at now. If you work in the private sector, you are subject to the National Labor Relations Act by and large. Obviously there are independent contractors and other situations that don't apply, but most of you listening probably do fall under the NLRA. So it's worth knowing a little bit of that history, kind of where it came from, some of the holes in the law. But at the end of the day, it does guarantee certain rights to organize, to have concerted activity, and to come together with your coworkers to try to organize a union, to join a union, and to ultimately negotiate a successful contract. So there's some regulations there on both sides. It's got some weaknesses, but that's the law we have until and unless we organize to make it a hell of a lot better.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.